what's going on in your body, what you're feeling in your heart, and what you're thinking in your mind. Have you ever heard the word inescapable shock? Have you ever been in a situation where you feel so very numb and unable to feel a situation, the emotions, the sensory sensations involved? Well, in today's video, I'm going to be talking about a term that I brought up in my live chat a couple days ago, known as inescapable shock. It's actually a term that is used when studying animals and mammals, in a way to try to understand operant conditioning or classical conditioning. I'll put the description of both of those terms in the description box below for you. It's a way that researchers try to understand the responses of human beings when they are stuck, when they are traumatized, when they have developed something known as learned helplessness. So inescapable shock is not something you can necessarily go to Google for and Google the term and come up with a very clear definition. It's pretty vague on Google. So I think I'm going to go ahead and tease apart what inescapable shock is for human beings from numbing and almost like this normal opioid release of hormones that you get when you experience pain. So let's go ahead and jump in. I want to introduce myself briefly for those who are new to the channel. My name is Tamara, and I'm an internationally and board certified trauma therapist. I'm also licensed in mental health, and I specialize in treating children, teens, and families, as well as adults who are dealing with trauma. Let's jump in. When you hear the term inescapable shock, what comes to mind for you? For a lot of my clients, when I bring up this term, they kind of look at me like, what is that? And, it's not an easy definition for someone like myself who does not study animals and who does not utilize animals to try to understand human behavior. So when I first heard of inescapable shock some years ago, I'm like, what does that mean? And when I tried to Google it, I only came up with a small definition. And that definition often included a Russian scientist by the name of Ivan Pavlov. He was a Russian scientist who utilized dogs and other animals to try to understand what's known as operant conditioning. Here's the definition right over here of operant conditioning. And I will post my live chat right up here. As soon as we're done with this video, go ahead and check that out because I talk a little bit more about Pavlov. But he utilized dogs to try to understand the human response to trauma and the human response to feeling stuck and numb in a situation. So when you hear the term inescapable shock, for you, I'm sure you're thinking, I feel stuck and I'm probably in shock because of a trauma that I've experienced. So we're going to go ahead with that definition, and that's the way I'm going to explain inescapable shock in this video. You recognize that it's not going to be easy to get out. It's not necessarily impossible, although it may feel like at times it is impossible, but it's not impossible, but that it's also not going to be easy for you to get out of a situation that's traumatic. So that's inescapable shock. It's almost as if the body and the brain wants to move, it wants to get out, it wants to swim, it wants to survive, and yet the body is saying, don't do it. And there's a reason for that. There's both a psychological and a physical component to inescapable shock. And researchers who have done research on this particular theory basically gave inescapable shock the term Physio-neurosis. And basically what that means is that there's an interplay or a relationship between the psychology and the physical aspects of trauma. Now, in my live chat that I did a couple days ago, you're probably going to, once you watch through some of the, the comments and all the rambling that I do, you're probably going to hear some new terms that you're not used to, like conditioned response and conditioned reflex, paradoxical inhibition. All of these terms have a lot to do with how the body reacts to trauma and high stress situations. If you have experienced family trauma or post-traumatic stress disorder or acute or chronic trauma because of family or some kind of relationship trauma, you're most likely going to experience a conditioned reflex, a conditioned response, a inescapable shock, for example, right? So go back to that chat. I encourage you once again to go back to that chat that chat and check that out, okay? Because I think it's going to illuminate some things for you, and you'll have some new terms to describe your experience. Now, there's something also known as a stress-induced analgesia, and here's what happens there. So you experience a traumatic situation. It could be physical, it could be psychological. You find the experience so traumatic and emotionally destabilizing that you don't know what to do. You feel stuck, you feel numb, you feel overwhelmed, right? You may even be experiencing some kind of physiological or physical sensations, like if you get into a traumatic car crash and your legs have been crushed in that crash, there's going to be a rush, in a sense, in your body that is going to numb your response. Now, some people regard that as adrenaline. Other people regard that as, what's the other thing? Endorphins. And still other people may call it like this natural opioid like numbing. It's almost like you're taking an analgesic right in that situation that is so very painful for you. So it's called a stress-induced analgesia. Your body is going through a stress response, which I always regard as central nervous system dominance or fight or flight. And that stressful situation has now caused this analgesic kind of sensation that you have in your body. And I also firmly believe, and research has also backed this theory up, that the analgesic effects of that stress or that trauma that you are experiencing in the moment, it may hit you really quickly, immediately in the moment, and then go away, and then you start to feel the pain, you know? But a lot of people aren't aware of that. So all they know is that in the moment they're experiencing something, it's like they're shocked or they're numb. And research suggests, and I also believe, that in that moment, there's a numbing kind of a experience that happens neurologically, and you may not process everything that's going on with you or everything that's happening to you in that particular situation, because there's an analgesic kind of effect that's happening because of the intensity of that trauma. I hope that makes sense. There's a lot of things that happens to the brain and the body when you are dealing with stress. I'm going to post my other video right up here where I talk about a traumatic brain injury, and I point out the different lobes of the brain and how they, kind of help us in our walk through trauma, right? It kind of helps us function. It kind of helps our brain determine when something is a threat, when something isn't. And the video that I did on traumatic brain injury really explains what happens to the brain when it is traumatized. So I encourage you to go check that video out. But I want to give you some examples briefly of the kinds of situations you can find yourself in that can create this inescapable shock. So I'm sure that if you have come from a family where there is physical and emotional and domestic abuse, I'm sure that all you can remember when you think back to those experiences are the sights, the sounds, and the sensations that you experienced during that time. The person who's being assaulted screaming. Maybe there's fighting and arguing. Maybe there's things being knocked over. Maybe you had increased heart rate during the time that this abuse was happening in the home. Maybe you had racing thoughts. Maybe you felt your body go numb. Maybe it went limp. Maybe you fainted or passed out, right? So I'm sure that when you think back to a traumatic situation that involved domestic violence or abuse or some kind of traumatic experience in the home environment growing up, so we can consider that childhood trauma, I'm sure you can remember bits and pieces of that experience, and the psychological, emotional, and physiological pieces of that situation stick with you. So ongoing childhood trauma that's of a domestic nature, abuse, neglect, sexual abuse, whatever, that can actually cause inescapable shock because you can't get out of the situation. You're stuck there to experience and maybe even re-experience multiple times, creating complex PTSD, that particular situation. So you're going to experience that trauma over and over again. There's no ability to get out, and there's no way to escape. Children who are dealing with childhood trauma don't have the psychological and neurological skills that they need to get out of it, then sometimes they don't even know that they can go to other adults and say, please help me, please call Child Protective Services, or, please have me put in a foster home. They don't have those language skills or that ability, right? So they are stuck in that particular situation, and that can cause a feeling of inescapable shock. The next situation would be traumatic bonding. So if you're in a situation where you feel bonded to the abuser and you're having a hard time escaping, even though you know that you need to, and we're not talking about codependency, we're talking about you being stuck in a position where, you love the nice part of that person so much that you're willing to dismiss the bad, and you're willing to dismiss the bad because that person is not always mean. That person is not always abusive. So you kind of create this split mindset, if you will, on this abusive individual, so that you can continue to experience life with them. That's traumatic bonding. Here's a video that I did maybe 2 years ago on that topic, and I talk about identifying and detoxing from the traumatic abuser, and I also talk about trauma bonds in that video, so go ahead and check that out. But traumatic bonding can also create inescapable shock. You're kind of numb, you're kind of going through the motions, you need to get out, you just can't, and you don't know what to do to get out. You're kind of stuck. The next is chronic triangulation. Now, you can experience inescapable shock just being in a relationship with someone, primarily your family, because that's what this channel is about, where you can't get out of that triangle. Every time you turn around, you are the persecutor, the one who's pointing the fingers. You are the rescuer to somebody else in your family. You're constantly in the middle. You may also find yourself being the victim in that triangle a lot of the time, because there's 3 different roles. I talk about triangulation right up here in this video if you want to go check that out, learn a little bit more about that. But if you are in chronic triangulation with your unhealthy and dysfunctional family, for example, then you most likely are going to experience inescapable shock. It's not easy to get out of triangulation. Once you're pulled in, you don't know how deep you're in until you start seeing the characters play things out. There's a movie that I'm going to post in the description box below for you, where, this young woman was very psychotic, very unhealthy. She had a personality disorder. She was also emotionally and psychologically abusive, moved in with an older woman and took control of not only her house, but her entire life. And she triangulated for as long as she could get away with it. And her tactics worked. But if you are constantly pulled into the middle of situations because of triangulation, inescapable shock can occur. The next thing that you are likely to experience inescapable shock in is being raised by a mentally ill parent. Now, mental illness, for the purposes of this video, I'm not regarding narcissists in that, or sociopaths, or people with avoidant personality disorder. I'm saying individuals with psychosis, like schizophrenia, some kind of paranoid disorder where there's delusions, also disorders where there are hallucinations and false beliefs are, really tightly held. You can't really sway them from believing what they believe, so they're delusional. They have a thought disorder where they have a hard time keeping up with facts and scenarios. They may get really lost in their mind. They really seem infantile and regressed in their emotional development and in their psychological development. So that's what I mean by mental illness for the purposes of this video. Individuals who need medication, probably need to be hospitalized, and really struggle with functioning in society. So being raised by a parent with those kind of difficulties and challenges can cause inescapable shock. We rely on our parents for safety, security, love, guidance, mutual respect. The list goes on. When you don't have that, whether that's as a child or whether that's as an adolescent or even an adult, it can really cause these feelings of entrapment, right? You may feel trapped. You may feel emotionally broken down, psychologically broken down, emotionally distraught. You may also feel all alone and isolated. That can all be the result of inescapable shock. The next thing is if you have a parent with a personality disorder like narcissism or sociopathy, or you have a parent with dependent personality disorder. I talk about that right up here in this video, so go ahead and check that out if you want. That will give you a little bit of additional details, okay? But parents who are like that have a personality disorder, something that cannot necessarily be treated with therapy and medication successfully at all times, that can cause inescapable shock. Growing up with a narcissist or a sociopath, someone with no empathy, someone with no consciousness or conscience, I should say, somebody that doesn't have the ability to step into your shoes and love you as their child, that can cause inescapable shock. And lastly, pathological liars, that can cause inescapable shock for sure. Being in a situation where you have a liar who's really good at pulling this piece together and pulling that piece together, and reaching up there and pulling that piece in and going under the carpet and pulling that information in, and really pulling it all together to make it look like it's something that's truthful, right? Some people do that when they are married. They pull as many pieces together as they can to make themselves look one way that they're not. And then the spouse later finds out during divorce that, oh my God, I didn't know this about you, this about you, this about you. You know what I mean? That kind of situation can really lead to inescapable shock. You feel stuck, trapped, unbelieved, and you may even go to law enforcement and they say, you know what, there's nothing we can do. Sometimes attorneys will tell you, sometimes there's nothing we can do. There's nothing to press charges on here. There's nothing to pursue here, right? Can you imagine that being a family member? You're in a legal situation with a family member who has crossed boundaries and they are really trying to take you through the ringer, and yet nobody on the outside believes you because they are really good at lying. Well, that can cause inescapable shock, a numbing experience where you feel trapped. You don't feel that you can get out. It's almost like learned helplessness, which I talk about right up here in this video if you want to go check that out as well. Learned helplessness can occur, which is this feeling that no matter what, I am stuck. So there is no sense in me trying to get out. All of these things can be the result of inescapable shock. Thank you so much for being with me in this video today, guys. I encourage you to give it a thumbs up if it was helpful, and go ahead and hit that subscribe button if you want to stick around with us. Stay tuned for the next video because we're going to be talking about resilience. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.